This is the story of my life, the life I lived, the life I can hardly believe was mine. It is a story that many of you may be living right now and not even realize it. This is a true account of the harrowing emotional abuse and trauma bonding that happened to me behind closed doors. I am coming forward now, openly and honestly sharing my cautionary tale. You may feel shocked to learn that relationships like this truly exist. I was too at one point. My goal in bravely telling my story is to bring awareness and shed light on this painful reality that too many women suffer in silence. I hope that by speaking my truth, I can empower others and maybe prevent someone else from having to endure what I did. If I could go back, I would tell my younger self to watch for the warning signs. But the most important thing is I survived, and I'm still here to share my story, proof that even after unimaginable darkness, the human spirit can persevere and thrive. This is the story narcissists don't want you to hear, but the story that must be told. The love bombing phase. When I first met my husband, he seemed absolutely perfect. He was charming, attentive, and made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. During our courtship, he showered me with affection and compliments. He idealized me and placed me on a pedestal. I felt euphoric being in his presence. It seemed like a fairy tale romance. We got married quickly, against the advice of my friends and family. I was blinded by love and couldn't see the flaws that were apparent to others. The first year of our marriage was blissful. He continued to dote on me and fulfill my every need and wish. I felt incredibly lucky to have found such an attentive, loving husband. We were the envy of all our friends. Of course, the initial excitement faded as we settled into married life, but he still treated me like a queen. If I wanted something, I got it, whether it was a shopping spree or an exotic vacation. Looking back, I can see how he groomed me into becoming dependent on his constant praise and gifts. I grew accustomed to the lavish lifestyle he provided. Meanwhile, we started our family right away. I got pregnant on our honeymoon, and we welcomed a healthy baby boy 9 months after our wedding. My husband was thrilled to become a father. He proudly showed off our son to all his friends and colleagues, presenting himself as a doting family man. 2 years later, we had a daughter, and our family felt complete. Of course, the realities of parenting were far from the rosy ideal my husband portrayed to the outside world. He was hardly ever around to help with late-night feedings, diaper changes, and doctor's appointments. I was often on my own handling the exhausting duties of caring for 2 young children. The few times I asked him to watch the kids so I could have a break, he acted annoyed and inconvenienced. Still, he kept up the facade in front of others that he was an involved, hands-on dad. Looking back now, I can see the early signs of manipulation. The devaluation phase. When our daughter turned 2, subtle changes started happening in my husband's behavior. The loving attention he showered on me faded. He became more critical of me, calling me too emotional or irrational whenever I expressed needs in our relationship. He started flirting with waitresses and other women in front of me, then called me crazy and jealous when I got upset. His temper flared more easily, and angry outbursts became commonplace. I found myself walking on eggshells, afraid to trigger his rage. The sweet, caring man I married had become a hostile stranger. I blamed myself and tried desperately to bring back the man I had fallen in love with. I lost weight, got implants, and initiated sex constantly, thinking if I were more attractive, it would reignite his passion for me. But he continued to pull away, working later and going out with the guys most nights. I now know he was likely cheating even back then, in the early years of our marriage. Adding to the stress, we were living far beyond our means. We had a huge mortgage on a home we couldn't really afford. My husband insisted on buying luxury cars, taking exotic vacations, and spoiling our kids with expensive gadgets and designer clothes. I gently suggested we scale back our spending so we weren't drowning in debt. This led to explosive arguments where he accused me of trying to control him and called me a gold digger, despite him being the one who insisted on the lavish lifestyle in the first place. I ended up buried in credit card debt just trying to keep up with the spending. This dynamic of idealizing me then devaluing me would play out repeatedly throughout our marriage in a sick cycle of dysfunction. Anytime I asked him to be accountable or expressed an unmet need, he turned it around on me, making me feel guilty for having normal human emotions and relationship needs. The crazy-making circular arguments left me riddled with self-doubt and anxiety. I became a shell of my former happy, confident self. The cheating. For the next decade of our marriage, I suspected my husband was cheating, but he adamantly denied it every time I questioned him. He insisted I was just being paranoid and jealous. He kept me isolated from friends and family, telling me no one would believe me anyway. Then I discovered flirtatious texts to younger coworkers on his phone. When I confronted him, he turned it around on me, saying I was snooping and trying to control him by not allowing him to have platonic friendships. The final smoking gun came when I learned he had taken one of those coworkers, Lisa, on a weekend trip to Vegas while lying to me that it was a work conference. When I confronted him this time, he locked himself in the bedroom for hours. When he emerged, red-faced, he said I had driven him to cheat by being such an insecure shrew of a wife, but he promised the affair was over. Like so many times before, I forgave him, blaming myself and trying desperately to win back his affection. Of course, the affairs never stopped for long. There were countless betrayed confidences and broken promises when it came to his serial cheating. Each D-Day devastated me to the core, but I kept taking him back, hoping if I forgave him and worked harder on the marriage, he would stop cheating. The trauma of living with his repeated infidelity nearly destroyed me, but at the time, I thought staying was my only option. The narcissistic rage and abuse. Whenever I challenged my husband's shady behavior or confronted him about his lies, he flew into narcissistic rages. These fits of anger could last for days, even weeks. He subjected me to screaming tirades where he would hurl brutal insults, calling me pathetic, ugly, stupid, and worthless. I was often left cowering and crying, which only enraged him more. He smashed furniture, punched walls, and threw things in destructive tantrums. The worst part was when he would give me the silent treatment, sometimes for weeks on end. This cold shoulder was his way of maintaining control through passive-aggressive manipulation. During these agonizing times, he acted as if I didn't exist, even if I begged and pleaded for him to talk to me. The isolation was unbearable. I became severely depressed and stopped interacting with friends because I was too ashamed of my life. When we had arguments, he would convince me I imagined or exaggerated things to cover up his lies. When I confronted him about a suspicious credit card charge for a hotel, he told me I was having memory problems and we had discussed him staying overnight for work. I started second-guessing my own sanity. Another time, I overheard him talking flirtatiously with a woman on the phone. When I asked who he was talking to, he denied speaking to any woman. He told me I was hearing voices and needed psychiatric help. I almost believed him. The manipulation and coercion. Whenever I caught my husband in a lie or confronted him about his hurtful behavior, he somehow managed to turn the situation around and blame me. He picked at my vulnerabilities to make me feel like everything was my fault. He accused me of preventing him from being happy. My love for him was used as a weapon against my own heart. After days of manipulation, I ended up apologizing just to mend things, even when I had done nothing wrong. I lost all respect for myself for not standing up to his bullying. The coercion went beyond emotional manipulation. Whenever I brought up divorce, he threatened to ruin me financially and take the kids from me. He said I would end up penniless and alone with no way to support myself. I now realize these were idle threats meant to scare me into submission, but at the time, I was terrified. I was already drowning in debt from his overspending and knew he would try to bleed me dry in a divorce. So I would capitulate, drop my attempts to leave him, and continue tolerating the intolerable. The impact on our children. Having grown up in an abusive household myself, I did everything in my power to shield our children from the dysfunction. When my husband raged and screamed at me, I made excuses and sent the kids to stay with friends or family members. But the impact of living with a narcissistic father could not be fully avoided. Our son acted out, getting into fights at school and arguments with authority figures. Our daughter became anxious and depressed, struggling with eating disorders and self-harm in her teen years. I tried to make up for their damaged father by helicopter parenting. I overcompensated and failed to set healthy boundaries. My children learned to exploit my guilt over their dysfunctional childhoods. Today, they have cut me out of their lives, which is devastating, although not entirely surprising given how my husband turned them against me. They see him as the victim and me as the problem, despite my efforts to protect them from him. This painful estrangement hurts worse than anything else. The discard. After over 20 years of living in a narcissistic hell, the abuse had taken an extreme toll on my health and psyche. I had tried couples counseling, individual therapy, support groups, you name it, but the toxicity always remained. When I gathered the courage to bring up divorce again, my husband discarded me without a second thought. His final act of cruelty was going on a smear campaign, spreading lies about me to the kids and anyone else who would listen. He filed for divorce first and sought full custody of our children, portraying himself as the victim of an unstable wife. Losing my husband was actually a relief after so many years of abuse. However, the trauma of the ordeal destroyed me financially, emotionally, and reputationally. I had no savings of my own after so many years as a financially controlled housewife. I could not afford a decent divorce lawyer and ended up giving up far more than my fair share just so I could end the nightmare once and for all. My husband manipulated my children against me and turned many friends and family members to his side. I was left broken, penniless, and isolated. The financial control. My husband wielded money as a weapon and tool of control throughout our marriage. Although he made a good living as an attorney, he handled all the family finances, allotting me only a small allowance each month. Major purchases and financial decisions had to be approved by him, even though I was often the one managing our day-to-day budget. He monitored my spending obsessively and would fly into a rage if I dared buy something without consulting him first. Once, when our daughter needed new soccer equipment, I used my allowance to pay for it without asking my husband first. When he saw the credit card statement, he canceled all my cards and cut me off entirely from any access to money. I had to beg for weeks just to get a small allowance reinstated. Another time, when I mentioned wanting to go back to work after years as a stay-at-home mom, he forbade me from getting a job, insisting no one would hire me anyway. He wanted to keep me financially powerless and dependent on him. In arguments, he would threaten to cut me off and kick me out onto the street, even though I had no income or savings of my own. Then he would buy me lavish gifts after the fight to keep me complacent, indebted to his generosity. When I finally filed for divorce, he hid money in secret accounts and fought me at every turn, trying to leave me penniless. The financial abuse was yet another way he maintained control and killed any autonomy or independence I tried to gain. The triangulation. My husband was a master at triangulation, pitting me against family members and friends to make me feel isolated and alienated. Early on in our relationship, he started pointing out my friends' flaws and concernedly warning me that they were using me. If I defended them, he accused me of choosing them over him. He slowly chipped away at all my closest childhood friendships, making me feel distrustful and paranoid until I dropped them entirely. The same thing happened with my family. He constantly criticized my parents, calling them judgmental and controlling until I started avoiding them. After our kids were born, he used them as pawns, bad-mouthing me to my own children behind my back. By the end, they saw me as the enemy rather than as the caring protector I always tried to be. His successful triangulation meant that when I finally left him, I had no close relationships left to turn to. The betrayal of losing my children and loved ones to his manipulation tactics haunts me to this day. The Grandiose Delusions. Despite his abusive behavior behind closed doors, my husband cultivated an image of himself in public as a doting father, faithful husband, and respectable businessman. He considered himself exceptionally smart, successful, powerful, and attractive. In truth, he was deeply insecure and used these delusions of superiority to mask feelings of inadequacy. No amount of accomplishment or adulation could satisfy his ego. Even as his career progressed and he gained more status in the community, it was never enough. He constantly compared himself to others, envious of anyone he deemed more successful. If I accomplished something like losing baby weight or advancing in a hobby, he made backhanded compliments, then suggested how I could improve further. He couldn't stand for me to get praise or outshine him in any arena. In conversations, he used lots of big words and name-dropped accomplishments. But if you listened closely, there was no substance behind most of his pompous ramblings. His quest for status drained our bank accounts and added to my credit card debt as he insisted on purchasing luxury items we couldn't afford to keep up appearances. Underneath it all, his fragility was evident in how much he depended on external validation while devaluing the people closest to him. The projection and blame shifting. My husband constantly accused me of the very qualities and behaviors that he possessed himself. He called me controlling whenever I asked where he'd been or who he was talking to. In reality, he was the one who controlled every aspect of my life. If I called him out on flirting with other women, he said I was being jealous and irrational. This projection enabled him to deflect blame and avoid any consequences for his inappropriate behavior. He accused me of being emotionally abusive anytime I called him out on his verbal attacks and rages. He told our children and friends that I was bipolar and unstable. In therapy, he convinced our counselor that I was the problem and primarily at fault for our marital issues. His skill at spinning narratives to make himself look like the victim was truly masterful. I started to question whether I really was crazy until it dawned on me that this was just another mind game. The hardest instances were when I caught him cheating red-handed, and he still found a way to turn it around on me. Once, he had left email correspondence with an escort service open on his computer. When I confronted him, he accused me of setting him up to test his fidelity. Another time, I walked in on him with another woman, and he somehow convinced our friends that I had just hallucinated the entire incident due to my marital paranoia. His ability to rewrite history and make me sound like the problem was infuriating and crazy-making. It took years to regain my own sense of reality. The intermittent reinforcement. The cycles of intermittent reinforcement kept me trapped in the relationship long after I realized it was deeply dysfunctional. After incidents of explosive rage, silent treatment, or affair discoveries, my husband would lure me back in by showering me with affection and gifts. He would cry, promising he had changed and that the abusive behavior was behind us for good. Like an addict, I fell for this honeymoon phase every time, hoping against hope that he had turned a corner. Of course, the sincerity never lasted long. A few calm, loving weeks would pass before some trigger caused him to rage at me again. Or he would disappear from home for nights at a time, only denying he had done anything wrong when he returned. It was a sick cycle of him pushing me away and then reeling me back in with false promises and superficial demonstrations of love. I kept believing that our relationship could get better if only I supported him enough during the good times. In reality, this intermittent reinforcement only served to strengthen my trauma bonding to him. The pathological lying. From early in our relationship, my husband lied to me constantly about both trivial and consequential matters. If I ever questioned his lies, he became defensive and made me feel guilty for doubting his word. I could catch him in a lie and he would still find a way to rewrite history and convince me I must be misremembering or conspiring against him. The lies intensified any time he wanted to conceal his cheating or abusive behavior. When I confronted him about a hotel charge on our credit card, he said I was mistaken and he must have told me he was staying overnight for work. If I ever questioned who he was on the phone with or where he'd been, he made up elaborate explanations to cover his tracks. Even if I had solid evidence proving his deception, he stuck to his story with such conviction that I ended up doubting myself. He lied about big things and small things with equal ease. If I asked what he wanted for dinner, he would make a request, then deny it an hour later. Confronted with his own text messages, he still claimed no memory of the conversation. Trying to have a sane relationship with someone who deliberately twisted the truth was impossible. I never knew what was real anymore. This loss of reality destroyed my confidence and grasp of the world around me. The reckless behavior. My husband constantly engaged in reckless and risky behaviors, both big and small. He drove aggressively, sped, and tailgated other cars, causing me anxiety whenever I had to ride with him. On vacations, he refused to follow safety precautions, insisting on doing dangerous activities like swimming in the ocean during a tropical storm. At home, he left burners on, doors unlocked, and major appliances unattended, seeming oblivious to fire and safety hazards. His most destructive risk-taking was in the extramarital affairs. He refused to use protection and exposed me to STIs on numerous occasions. The first time I got chlamydia from him, he accused me of cheating until I confronted him with the proof. He also got involved with unstable, manipulative women who had drug issues and even made threats to me when I exposed the affairs. Rather than feel remorse, he seemed to get an adrenaline rush from courting danger in so many ways. I lived in constant fear of what catastrophic consequence would result next from his thrill-seeking behaviors. The gaslighting. Gaslighting was one of my husband's most insidious forms of manipulation and control. He often convinced me that I was misremembering or exaggerating events to cover up his lies or inappropriate behavior. If I ever confronted him with evidence that contradicted his version of events, he became outraged and accused me of plotting against him. He had a way of twisting things around so that I ended up feeling crazy for even suspecting him of wrongdoing. Once, after a suspicious 3 a.m. phone call, I asked who he was speaking with, and he insisted it was just a wrong number. Later, I checked the caller ID and number in his phone contacts and matched it to a woman he worked with. But when I presented this, he somehow still made me feel paranoid and ashamed for checking up on him. There were countless instances like this where I knew the truth deep down, but ended up acquiescing and apologizing, my reality completely distorted by his manipulations. The worst part was I could never prove anything. He always had an airtight alibi or reverse accusation ready. The social isolation. Cut off from family and friends, I endured years of abuse with few people to turn to outside of my unhealthy marriage. My husband slowly isolated me early on with criticisms about loved ones that made me distrust the people closest to me. Once we had kids, using protecting the children as an excuse, he made me cut ties with my family and childhood friends entirely. I was not allowed to work or have hobbies that involved leaving the house. He wanted me barefoot and pregnant at home, entirely dependent on him financially, socially, and emotionally. If I tried to maintain independent friendships, he accused me of cheating. When his raging and affairs escalated over the years, I had no one to confide in. He made me feel too ashamed to reveal how bad things had gotten to the few remaining friends I had. It was incredibly lonely, the walls of my prison getting smaller every year. He was my only human contact, making his intermittent abuse that much more traumatic. I felt like I was on an island with him, and there was no way out. By the time he discarded me, I was but a shell of person, isolated and fragile. Rebuilding connections after the trauma of his coercive control took intense work, but ultimately gave me the strength to survive. The smear campaigns. When I first announced my intention to divorce him, my husband launched an aggressive smear campaign to destroy my reputation. Among our family and friends, and even to our own children, he spread vicious lies about me, abandoning the family, being an alcoholic, abusing prescription pills, and having multiple affairs of my own. Those who knew me well saw through his slander, but more distant acquaintances believed his claims, or at least began to question what kind of person I was. Thankfully, I had a strong legal case with evidence of his affairs and emotional abuse. Still, he tried every trick to drag my name through the mud during divorce proceedings, attempting to subpoena false witnesses from my past to paint me as mentally unstable. Having to combat the character assassination on top of grieving the end of my marriage was unbearable. Worst of all, my teenage children believed his lies about me, devastating our once close relationship. The damage to my relationships from his vindictive smears outlived the divorce itself. The aftermath and recovery. In the aftermath of my divorce, I descended into the dark abyss of PTSD and depression. Some days I wasn't sure I could go on living. The emotional abuse had shredded my soul. More than once, I contemplated ending the unbearable pain permanently. With intensive therapy and support groups, I gradually climbed out of that pit. Going no contact with my abusive ex was critical to focus entirely on my recovery without his toxicity. Today, I'm a survivor, not a victim. I reclaimed my sense of self, rebuilt my confidence, and took back control of my life. I nurture healthy friendships that sustain me. And I find purpose in sharing my cautionary tale, helping other women recognize they don't deserve abuse. There are still hard days when my ex's cruelty overwhelms me, but focusing on my hard-won growth helps me feel proud of surviving rock bottom. This harrowing experience left me wounded, but also wiser, stronger, more resilient, and deeply compassionate. I wouldn't wish a narcissistic relationship on my worst enemy, yet I wish every survivor embraces their inner strength. Our shared struggles make us unbreakable. This winding path to healing can feel lonely, but we walk it together, lifting each other into the light. Picking up the shattered pieces of my life was the hardest thing I've ever done. I liken my recovery to gradually thawing after being frozen for decades. I slowly relearned self-care after years of neglect. Making simple decisions without permission felt scary yet freeing. Rediscovering old hobbies and interests brought me back to life. Despite the unfair divorce settlement, I was determined to make it on my own. Working entry-level jobs helped me pay off debts and build savings. My credit score recovered to the 700s. While I may never restore my previous lifestyle, I cherish my financial freedom. I found an empowering community of fellow survivors for emotional support, and I'm slowly repairing relationships my ex tried to destroy. Some scars linger, but now I have tools and a community to cope, rather than suffer silently alone. I've learned to love my resilient spirit and have faith in good people. Though he tried to crush me, what I've rebuilt is even stronger. My empowerment is the greatest revenge against my narcissistic abuser.